Class A regulations cover all jet aircraft and large propeller-driven aircraft that hopefully you guys will be flying once you've passed your exams and completed your flight training. The Class A regulations have the same fundamental philosophy as Class B regulations. It's all about being conservative. We don't want to use all the runway, we don't want to go all the way up to the max weight, rely too heavily on the wind, etc, etc. But they are a little bit more complicated, which is what we're going to have a look at in this class. Hi, I'm Grant and welcome to the 14th class in the Performance series. Today we're going to be having a look at Class A regulations. Class A regulations are a bit more restrictive than Class B regulations, basically because the planes are heavier, faster, carry more people. So we need to be a little bit more safety conscious than we are with Class B aircraft. It's essentially the same thing though. It's all about being conservative, and that's what we're going to have a look at in this class. A Class A aircraft is a jet aircraft or a turboprop aircraft which is larger than 5,700 kgs maximum takeoff mass, or one with 9 or more passenger seats. And one of the most in-depth topics for Class A regulations is the takeoff, which is what we're going to start with, and it will take maybe a little while. It all revolves around the idea that a Class A aircraft must be able to either reject the takeoff and stop safely within the runway available, or continue with one engine out from any point on the runway. If it cannot meet these requirements, then the aircraft will not be able to legally fly in and out of aerodromes with passengers on board. A normal takeoff with two engines running is what we normally do day to day, but it's not really the focus of the Class A regulations takeoff. So we're going to be taking a look at the engine failure takeoff that needs to be able to achieve certain performance criteria, which we'll dive into in the upcoming class. So an engine failure on takeoff will look something like this. I'll be mentioning a few V-speeds along the way, which I gave a bit of an insight into in that bonus class that I did, which I'll link down in the description. So what we do is we set takeoff power from a stationary point on the runway and start to go down the runway. And say at this point here we have our engine failure. This would be our engine failure speed, VEF. We then continue to accelerate and we reach our decision speed, V1, which I'll expand on in the next bit of paper because it's quite important. We then continue down and reach our rotation speed, where we pitch the aircraft up. We then pass VMU, the minimum speed for this aircraft to safely make it into the air. This may also occur before VR. And then we reach the point where all wheels leave the ground for real. We get VLOF. After takeoff, we aim to fly at V2 speed, which is a takeoff safety speed, while passing a 35-foot screen height. This V2 speed ensures a safe margin above the stall while still being able to achieve sufficient control and a reasonable climb rate. We then get into the initial climb phase where we have to achieve a net takeoff flight path, just like in the Class B regulations, but it's a little bit more complex for Class A. So V1 is a hugely important speed. It is the point of no return. Above this speed, we're going into the air with whatever problems we have. There simply isn't enough runway left to stop the aircraft safely. During the takeoff, the captain will actually remove their hand from the thrust levers when V1 is called, so that they are no longer tempted to close the thrust levers and abort the takeoff. One way to think of V1 is as a stop or a go speed. If we think of the first part of that, the stop part, then we can work out a maximum speed we can travel down the runway and still stop safely within the accelerate stop distance available. This will be faster if we have a longer runway or if we have a lower aircraft weight, because a lower aircraft weight means we can accelerate faster, reach our takeoff speed faster, and have more runway left over to safely stop the aircraft. We can plot this on a graph and it looks like a line like this. So we have the heavier the weight, the lower our stop speed has to go. We have to reject the takeoff earlier in order to be able to still stop the aircraft in a set length of runway. If we then think about the go part of V1, we can also work out a minimum speed we need to achieve to be able to get into the air with an engine failure and pass the screen height at that 35 foot that is required for Class A regulations, or the takeoff distance available. If we are heavier, then it is harder to accelerate the aircraft. So if one of our engines fails and we lose half of our thrust, then it can be a lot harder to continue to accelerate up to a safe speed for liftoff above that VMU speed. So we must accelerate close to that speed for liftoff before the engine fails, making our line for our go speed look something like this. This means we get a few distinct sections of the graph. We have a section here where we are safe. We have a section here where we can't stop or go. We have a section here where we can't stop because we have an insufficient accelerate stop distance available. And we have a section here where we can't go because we have insufficient takeoff distance available after our engine has failed and we've lost that thrust. So we have to have a V1 speed within this section somewhere, because that's the only point in the graph where we can both stop and go safely. So even though it might be well within this region, our V1 speed, where we can stop or go if we want when we use it, if we call out V1 and we are faster than that, we are committing to going. Or if we're slower than that, we're committing to stopping. Even if we know there's margin, it's a very hard line speed. If there's plenty of buffer, doesn't matter, it's not important. And usually, when approaching V1, we're more likely to go anyway, because a high speed rejected takeoff can risk brake fires, tires popping, and a tire popping could lead to a loss of directional control. So it's generally safer if you're closer to V1 to go into the air. V1's a very hard rule. If you're above it, you go into the air. Can't stress that enough. It is a hard line limit. So at a certain weight range, you might only have maybe one V1 speed available. If you're this heavy, that buffer, that line there could be a 1 knot, so you've got one exact V1 speed. But down in this sort of weight range, you can see you've got a whole range of possible V1 speeds. And you can select one that's lower or select one that's higher. But normally the airlines that you're flying for will choose something on the higher side of the range, because we're generally better off staying on the ground if we have an engine failure situation. So you can accelerate to a higher speed and still reject the aircraft before getting close to V1 and thinking, oh, I better take this into the air. But it's also very dependent on the airport that you're at, the day. It's one of these situations that changes depending on conditions and where you are and things like that. V1 also has other few restrictions on it that tie in with the typical takeoff profile that we looked at before. So V1 has to be less than VR, because we can't commit to rotation and lift off before the decision speed. V1 also has to be less than VMBE, which I didn't actually mention on that graph, but it's the maximum brake energy speed. So it has to be less than the maximum speed the brakes can operate safely. So that hopefully makes sense. You want the brakes to still be reliable when you might decide to stop. And it also has to be larger than the speed for minimum control on the ground, because we need to be able to control the aircraft on the ground in case of a rejected takeoff. So just like Class B regulations, we need to be able to achieve takeoff within a certain distance that when a safety factor is added in, it still remains below the total available distances. It's just a little bit more complicated with Class A stuff, just like everything in Class A stuff. So first we're going to look at the takeoff distance required. This will be calculated using the graphs in the CAP 618, for example, or some sort of performance app that you might have for the specific aircraft you're flying. It is the longer of the distances from the start of the roll to a 35 foot screen height with the critical engine failing, or with two engines, we take that number multiplied by 1.15, and that has to be less than the takeoff distance available. So the longer is the more restricting, because we want to take off in a shorter distance. And if it's a wet runway, it's slightly different. We basically have to compare all three numbers, the two engine times 1.15, the single engine in dry conditions, or the single engine case in wet conditions. The other set of numbers we have to compare are the takeoff run required. So for a dry runway, it's the distance from the start of the roll to a point where all wheels leave the ground, the VLOF, plus half the distance between this point and the point where the aircraft reaches the screen height, multiplied by 1.15 for two engines, or in the single engine case, we just take that actual number and compare it to the takeoff run available. So what that actually means visually is we accelerate up to VLOF, our wheels leave the ground, and then we pass 35-foot screen height. Our takeoff run actually ends when all of our wheels leave the ground, the VLOF speed, but we take half of the distance that's left over between VLOF and 35 feet and add that on to our actual takeoff run to get a little bit of a safety factor built in, a little bit of allowance for the wrong rotation rate. Maybe it was a bit slow, we didn't get off the ground quite as quick, things like that. So yeah, if it's dry, we use those numbers, and if it's wet, we calculate the wet values, and again, we just take a 1.15 safety factor on the two engine, or we use the single engine. So in the first case, the takeoff distance required, we're comparing three numbers if it's wet, but on the takeoff run required, we ignore these two numbers at the top and we just calculate the actual wet distances, which will be longer because the wheels have less grip. It'll take longer to accelerate. The accelerate stop distance required, we don't add in any factor for the two engine or the one engine case. We just compare them. So it's the two engine accelerate stop distance required versus the one engine accelerate stop distance required, and they both have to be less than the available distance. The actual distance that we're calculating for the required is from the start of the roll up to V1 and back down to a stationary position, and then we add on 2 seconds traveling at V1 speed. So if you're traveling at 150 knots or something, for 2 seconds, whatever distance that is, you add that on to the end to get, again, just a slight decision time built in. You might not react immediately, you might not close the thrust levers as quickly as you should have. So this 2 seconds at V1 speed sort of takes that into account. And then if it's wet, we physically calculate the wet numbers for the one engine and the two engine and compare them again. So that's a lot of calculations to make sure we are safely below all of the maximum distance available on the runway that we're on. So what we can do is use the balance field principle. This is where the accelerate stop distance available equals the takeoff distance available, which means that we make the clearway, normally included in the takeoff distance available, reduce down to the same length as the stopway. It just means that we reduce the number of calculations, but it might limit how much weight we would be able to load on and still achieve the Class A regulations. So balance field sort of reduces the calculations, otherwise you're having to do, on a wet runway, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different calculations just to make sure you're within all these ranges. Whereas if you reduce it down, you'd only have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a little bit helpful. During a normal takeoff with two engines running, there's usually plenty of excess thrust to achieve a suitable angle of climb for obstacle clearance. Remember that climb angle is the thrust minus the drag over the weight, so the excess thrust. For a jet aircraft or the gradient, you just times that by 100. So what we can do is use the thrust from a high takeoff setting, almost maximum power, to accelerate the aircraft and lower off the climb angle, or we can reduce the thrust to a lower climb setting and still be able to climb because there's just so much excess. The reason why we do either of these little things is to do with noise usually. If we can reduce the thrust close into the airport, it will reduce the noise for the residents who live near there. And if the airports are not near anything built up, then we can accelerate and not have such a great vertical distance between ourselves and in the aircraft and the earth. The two procedures are called NADP1 and NADP2. NADP1, Noise Abatement Departure Procedure 1, follows this profile. We climb away at V2 plus 10 knots or faster, and then at or above 800 feet above ground level, my company uses 1500 feet for example, we then reduce the thrust to an appropriate climb setting, but we maintain the takeoff configuration. This means we still climb away quite steep, increasing the vertical distance between us and the residents' houses nearby. And when we pass 3,000 feet above ground level, we reduce the angle of climb and use some of this excess thrust to accelerate the aircraft and retract the flaps, allowing us to accelerate to a faster en route climb speed. So NADP1 is for noise sensitive areas. NADP2 is where we're not really that bothered about noise close into the airport. Maybe we're climbing over the sea or something like that. In this procedure, we reduce the thrust and accelerate at the same time at or above 800 feet AGL. We use 1,000 foot AGL in my company. What we do is we basically use up some of the excess thrust to accelerate rather than using all of it to climb steeper. This means that we are closer to the ground for a bit longer, but we get to a faster climb speed earlier. We have less drag for longer, and it is generally the preferred default option used by airlines. So while we might climb away on two engines using NADP 1 or 2, if we have an engine failure situation, we need to consider the net takeoff flight path. The net takeoff flight path will allow us to safely clear all obstacles with our reduced single engine or 3 engine performance if we're flying a 4 engine plane. And it's a little bit more complicated than for Class B aircraft, and it is split into 4 segments. The first of which starts from a screen height of 35 feet up to the point where the gear is retracted. And in this section, you can see these requirements. We have to have a 0% climb at least, so it means measurably positive. Or in a 4 engine aircraft, it's 0.5%. The gear has to be in the process of traveling up. Flaps are in the takeoff position, takeoff thrust is set, and a speed of VLOF or greater. The second section continues on until an altitude where we accelerate, which is dependent on any obstacles near the airport that lie within the obstacle accountability area. Same as for Class B, that sort of starting and then fanning out shape. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and watch the Class B regulations video. So if there was something in this section we would need to clear that was a bit closer in, we might need a requirement for climb that is greater than 2.4% or 3%, but 2.4% would be the absolute minimum. It is also important to note that these are gross performance characteristics, not net. Net is like the worst of the worst, and we apply a safety factor to get the gross results. For a twin engine aircraft, this is 0.8%, and for a 4 engine, it's 1% for this net takeoff flight path. So our absolute minimum climb gradient for the second segment, if we take away that safety factor, is 1.6%, and we'd still ensure a 35-foot obstacle clearance throughout this segment. However, that's a bit uncomfortable, so we add in the 0.8% safety margin to make it 2.4% and allow for even better obstacle clearance. In the third segment, we begin an acceleration, and it's the altitude at which this occurs is dependent on this 35-foot terrain clearance that we need, and it basically allows us to retract the flaps, speed up or retract the flaps, and get up to a safe, clean speed. It's usually the minimum clean speed because this allows for any excess thrust to be used to continue to climb. If in this section there was an obstacle that would require us to climb higher, we might have to maintain the second section for longer to get up to a suitable height to then shallow off our climb gradient and still clear an obstacle that was located here, for example. The fourth segment starts once we are clean and up to a suitable clean speed, and it usually continues up to 1,500 feet AGL, but again, might be higher depending on mountains in the area. And at this point, the thrust can be reduced slightly to a maximum continuous maximum continuous thrust setting, and we continue to climb away from the ground. So there's quite a lot of climb gradients that we need to consider and think about, and this is sort of the minimum level. Terrain might make these higher, so it might limit your weights that you're able to take with you on takeoff in case of this single engine failure. And we need to achieve all of these. So we might not be able to achieve the 1.2% climb gradient in the second or the third segment even, if we weigh 60,000 tons, 60,000 kilos, 60 tons. So what we could do is we could reduce our weight so that we improve and are able to achieve this 1.2%. In the cruise, the regulations aren't that in depth, but the main ones revolve around having an engine failure. If we have an engine failure, we have less excess thrust available, which will restrict our ability to climb. It will also result in a likely reduction in our ability to fly as fast as we once were because we don't have as much thrust. And that will mean we have to descend down into more dense air, therefore produce a little bit more thrust on that single engine to be able to fly fast again. This procedure is known as a drift down procedure. And for Class A aircraft, we need to ensure that if we have to descend down due to an engine failure, we do so in a way that keeps us clear of any obstacles en route, so that's within 5 nautical miles of our track, by a margin of 1,000 feet, or if we need to climb over anything within 5 nautical miles, we can do that by 1,000 feet, with a suitable climb gradient of 1.1% gross for twin engine, or 1.6% gross for a 4-engine plane. Alternatively, if we can't achieve the 1,000 foot climb requirement, as it may be too punishing for weight restrictions, then we can amend the descent requirement to be clearing everything by 2,000 feet in the descent. These requirements for en route performance must take into account the meteorological conditions of the day and also ensure that the plane can maintain at least a positive gradient when 1,500 feet above any diversion airfield that's suitable en route. On landing, we need to be able to go around safely if the approach becomes unstable or if the runway becomes blocked or anything like that. We do this by applying full power and pitching the nose up in order to climb away from the runway. Class A regulations dictate that if we do this, we need to be able to achieve a climb gradient of at least 3.2% if we're in a twin engine aircraft, and that would be in the landing configuration with a climb speed of 1.13 VSR0 or VMCL. And it can be steeper than this depending on the airport surroundings, so this is like an absolute minimum. And if we have an engine failure, we need to be able to make it 2.1% climb gradient. In a twin engine aircraft or in a 4-engine aircraft, this is 2.7%. This is assuming that the critical engine has failed and the aircraft has its landing gear retracting and in the process of being up, but the flaps are still in the landing configuration with a climb speed of 1.41 VSR0. And to me, that's a whole bunch of numbers, and when I was reading it, refreshing my memory, I was just like, what does this actually boil down to? And what it means is that we have to be low enough in weight that if we need to go around, our mass allows us to achieve the climb performance required with both engines running or with one of them failed. When we don't go around and we land, we need to be able to land within 60% of the total landing distance available if we are in a jet in order to comply with Class A regulations, which means that we can multiply the landing distance required times 1.67 and compare it to the landing distance available, or take the landing distance available, multiply by 0.6 to find a new limit. And if we're in a turboprop, it's 70% of the distance. So again, we can either take the landing distance available times by 0.7 and compare it to the landing distance required, or take the landing distance required, multiply it by 1.43 and make sure that it is less than the landing distance available. And this landing distance is from a 50-foot screen height to a full stop, but with special approval, the screen height can be reduced to 35 foot. The speed passing the screen height is the V reference speed, and it must be at least 1.23 VSR0, which the landing configuration reference speed, sorry. And we also have to take into account runway slope, use 50% of the headwind, 150% of the tailwind, and if it's wet, we add in another 15% margin. So we would calculate the dry landing distance required, times by 1.15, and then compare it with that 60 or 70% requirement, depending if it's a jet or a turboprop. So due to these requirements of both the go-around climb and landing distance, it can sometimes mean that we are limited on landing distance because of the requirement for the climb in case of a go-around, restricting our fuel load or our cargo that we can carry. This is obviously not great if the weather conditions on the day push you out of limits for the climb gradient, for example, That would mean you might have to kick passengers off the flight. You know, they wouldn't be very happy. So there's a workaround for these situations where we can have at least 2 backup alternate aerodromes where we would be able to land safely regardless of the headwind or any other environmental factors that would help us. It just means that we have some other options that are safe bets, and we wouldn't be stuck with the only option being breaking our regulations to land. So to summarize then, we're just going to use the CAP 698 document. This is the medium range jet transport section. I've basically split the document into 2, taken the class A stuff here and the class B stuff was in a different section that I've put to one side for now. So basically what I'm saying is get familiar with this document. I was looking at this document all the time when I was creating this class. It's got all the information you really need in it. There are a few little things that might not be included, but yeah, it's a very, very good source of information. I use this in my exam a lot to get familiar with everything, and yeah, even still using it now to write these classes. So yeah, if you look at the first pages, it's got all the definitions, it's got some masses, it's got information about all these V speeds. You know, you don't have to even look at my class anymore. Well, you should, but you don't have to look at my class anymore. They're all in here. It's all very straightforward. It's all laid out. Let's think of something like, so let's think about those. We're near the front. The takeoff stuff will be near the front, yes. So if you think about those takeoff distance requirements and the accelerate stop distance requirements, all this kind of stuff, it's all in here. So this is the all power units operating, factorized by 1.5 to obtain the net takeoff run required. 1 power unit inoperative. 1 power unit operative on a wet runway. Accelerate stop distance is, you know, plus the 2 seconds at V1. All engine 1.15. It's got all the good stuff in it, should you need it. And basically, yeah, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because that's going to be boring. There's way too much of it. We'll have a look at some of the graphs in the next questions, the next class, sorry. I'll pick some questions. We'll do some examples of the graphs, just show you how they all work and show you that it's a lot easier than it needs to be made out. The graphs aren't a big deal. It shows you what to do. It's got guidelines of how to do it up there, examples of how to do everything. So we'll just do a few example questions and show you how to work your way through in the exam.